Okay, so for number 3, we have a round plant. That is homozygous dominant, so big R, cross with a wrinkled plant. That is little r. So these are the P generation of the parents. Okay, and so it says that Mendel crossed those plants and continued crossing each generation. And what did he find in common? So if we were to cross these plants, so mate those two parents together, we would see that the first generation, or we call this the F1 generation, the first generation, are all heterozygous. So 100% big R, little r. We usually would use the term heterozygous. He actually called them hybrids. So 100% hybrids for the F1 generation. And then he took that F1 generation, so these guys here, and he crossed them with each other. So this is now the F. We cross those with each other, we end up with a Punnett square very similar to this. These guys are the F2 generation. Okay, one thing we notice in the F2 generation, we have 1, 2, 3 here that would be round. So we have 3 round, just because they have the big R, they're all 3 here round, and we have 1 wrinkled. Okay, so one thing that we could say is F1 generation 100% hybrids, F2 or the second generation, we have 3 round to 1 wrinkled. So I'll leave you to choose the correct answer for that one. For number 4, we have a white mouse. So we take a white mouse and we cross it with a brown mouse. And then all of a sudden we see that all the offspring are completely different color. They're buckskin or tan. So as soon as you start to see a new color come about with offspring and a color that's actually in between or a mix of the two, this is an example of incomplete dominance. Or the mode of inheritance, as the question asks, is incomplete dominance. So for part A, it's incomplete dominance, partly because that tan is a mix of the two parents together. For part B, if we needed to come up with a genotypic key or a genotype key for these parents, the white, let's say big W was white. Let's say big B is brown. And the reason why we use the capital letters instead of one lowercase and one uppercase is because both of these are dominant. The white color and the brown color are dominant, so we want to have 2 uppercase letters for each of the traits. But the buckskin is when the offspring has 1 of each. So a big B and a big W. Okay, so this would be our key: big W, big B, big B, big W. Okay, and then for part C, we have Jeanette, who is taking a big B, big W, and a big B, big W, or 2 buckskins, and she's crossing those 2 together. So if she were to cross those 2 together, she would actually end up with, and I'm going to continue this up here so we have a little more space. Okay. So if she were to take these and cross them, she would end up with something like this. 1 baby, 1 baby W, 1 baby W, and then 1 big W. So if we had to come up with the genotypic ratios, so let's start with the genotypes. Okay, the genotypes for these would be 1 big B to 2 big B, big W's, because these 2 are big B, big W's, to 1 big W, big W. So that would be the genotype. The phenotypes, that's what they physically look like. So the phenotypes would be 1 brown to 2 buckskin, because if you have 1 of each letter, you're buckskin or you're tan, to 1 white. This one would be white. So those are your genotypes, and then these are your phenotypes for number 4, for part C of number 4. All right, so if we go on to number 5, we are doing a dihybrid cross here. So, so for number 5, we are taking one parent that is heterozygous gray, so big G, little g, and straight hair, so it has to be 2 little w's, so they tell us that straight hair is recessive. And we're crossing that with a parent that is white, so little g, but heterozygous for wavy, so big W, little w. Okay, so these would be the parent genotypes. All right, so then if we want to complete the Punnett square, we first have to figure out the gametes, or the different combinations that each parent can contribute. So this parent could give a big G, little w. It could also give a little g and a little w. So these are 2 different gametes that parent could give. This parent could give a little g and a big W, or a little g and a little w. One thing to keep in mind, we say that alleles segregate, so these guys have to segregate, meaning each parent can only give one of each letter. So it has to give a G and a W, but it's up to the different combinations as to what parents can give. This parent can give a big G and a little W, or a little g and a little w, because those are the only options that this parent really has to work with. This parent could give a little g and a big W, or it could give a little g and a little w. These are the only 2 options that parent could pass on. So when we do our Punnett square, we actually don't need the full Punnett square that your teacher has on the quiz. We just need one that's a 2 by 2, because each parent has 2 options. So I'm just going to do a big G, little w, little g, little w there, little g, big W, and little g, little w. Okay? So we can kind of keep track of what each parent can contribute. So in this case, we have big G, little g, big W, little w. In this one, we also have big G, little g, but then we have 2 little w's. For this one, we have little g, big W, little w. And for this parent, we have little g, little w, little w. Okay. Now your teacher asks for the phenotypic, or the physical traits. So let's go through each 4 of these options and see the physical traits that these parents could have for their offspring. This gerbil, or this gerbil right here, would be gray, wavy. And the big G is gray, big W is wavy. This one would be white, wavy, which has a big W, but 2 little G's makes it white. And we have 1 of each of these so far. This one would be gray with straight hair. So one that's gray with straight hair. Okay. And then this last one would be white with straight hair. So if you notice, we kind of have 1 of each physical trait. So these are the phenotypes, the possible phenotypes that these 2 parents could produce. 1 gray wavy, 1 white wavy, 1 gray straight, and 1 white straight. So 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. Okay, so then if we go into number 1 that's on the back of the quiz, offspring that result from crosses between true breeding parents with different traits. So let's switch up here and look at an example. We can kind of use this example to answer the next few questions. I'll talk through kind of what each question is asking, but I'll leave it up to you to figure out which multiple choice option would be the best answer for each of the questions. All right, so they're saying that we have 2 purebred or true breeding plants. One thing to keep in mind, true breeding means heterozygous. So you can think of it as true breeding is the same as, or AKA, homozygous. Okay? So they're saying we have 2 true breeding plants that have different traits. So let's say we have big T. That's an example of a homozygous dominant. And let's say we have little t, homozygous recessive. Both of these would be considered true breeding, or purebred is another word too. Okay, if you're big T, you would be tall. If you're little t, you would be short. Okay, so they're true breeding and they have different traits, which is kind of what the question is asking. So it's saying if we were to cross these two parents, what will we end up with? Well, if we cross these two parents, okay, and we'll do the Punnett square on this side, we would notice that we end up with all heterozygous offspring. Okay, because they get one letter from each parent. So we end up with 100% hybrids or heterozygous. Okay? And all those hybrids would actually be tall. They would actually all look like that tall parent. Okay? So for number 2, Mendel concluded that traits are, one thing that's important to keep in mind with Mendel's experiments is he studied both dominant and recessive traits, and he came to the conclusion that the most important thing for heredity is that we inherit our traits from our parents. So it's not 100% accurate to say that dominant traits are more important or that recessive traits or recessive alleles are more important. In fact, it's more thorough to actually say, more accurate to say that offspring inherit the traits from their parents. Okay, so that should kind of help you with question number 2. For number 3, when Mendel crossed true breeding tall plants, so that's like what we had here, big T, he crossed those with true breeding short plants, little t, all of the offspring were tall because, so 2 things that we want to kind of revisit with this scenario. Not only when we cross these 2 together do we get all 100% hybrids, we also get all 100% of them are all tall. Okay, and the reason why they're all tall is because that dominant allele automatically gives them the dominant trait, which is tall, or that dominant allele overpowers that recessive allele. Okay? Another way of also kind of looking at that is that the allele for height or tallness is a dominant trait. So because they have the big T, they have that dominant trait for tall. So that should help you with number 3. Number 4, so they're saying in the P1 or in the P generation, a tall plant was crossed with a short plant, and then short plants reappeared in the F2 generation. Okay, so we can kind of use this exact same scenario to help us answer question number 4. So they're saying that when they cross these 2 together, they got 100% tall. Okay, so this would be the F1 generation, it's the first generation. These guys are the P generation, or the parents. So these are the parents, but this is the F1 generation, or that first generation. If we were to then take these guys here, so big T, and another big T, and cross those, these would give us the second generation. So if we cross those, let's see what we actually end up with for the different options. So big T, big T, Okay. So now if we look at this, so the parents, we had a tall parent and a short parent. They made it together. They only had all tall offspring. But then if we took these tall plants or these tall offspring and mated them together, we notice that the short trait reappears. Okay. And so the question is asking, why is it that we had no tall plants in that first generation, but all of a sudden that short trait kind of reappears again? Well, the answer would be that this short plant that's here received a recessive allele from one parent and a recessive allele from the other parent, and that's how they got the little t. So that should help you in answering question number 4. Okay. Another way of also looking at this too is that in order for this parent to give a little t and for this parent to give a little t, these alleles have to separate or segregate. So when these alleles separate, one goes to that child, and when then these alleles separate, that one goes to that child too. All right. So then if we kind of talk about 5 and 6, one thing to keep in mind with probability is only able to help you predict possible traits of offspring. It can never help you find the actual outcomes. You'd actually have to make the organisms together to see the actual outcomes. But probability, same thing with Punnett squares, is they help you predict possible outcomes or help you estimate possible probabilities. So these Punnett squares, just like with probability, never really allows you to predict actual outcomes all the time. Now, one thing that we could say is if we cross a big T tall with a little t short, we know that all of their children need to be tall. So we could say for certainty that all their children would be tall. But if we have a situation like this where we have two heterozygous organisms, we can't say for sure if all of their children will be tall. Now, most of their children should potentially be tall because there's a 75% chance of being tall, but you still have this small chance of them having a short child. So this is just helpful to help predict possible outcomes. Okay, so that should help you with questions 5 and 6. For number 7, if we have a parent that is, let's look at number 7. Big R, big Y, little y. Okay. We need to predict the possible gametes. One thing to keep in mind with gametes is that in order for a parent to pass on traits to their children, their alleles have to separate, or their letters have to separate, and they have to then be passed on to their child. So we want to figure out the different ways that these letters can separate, keeping in mind that each parent can only give one of each letter. So this parent could give a big R, a big Y. It could give a big R, a little y, because it has to give one of each letter. It could give a little r and a big Y, or it could give a little r and a little y. So there are technically 1, 2, 3, 4 different possible gametes that this parent could pass on. Okay, so then that takes us to the last question, number 8. So for number 8, they say that we had a red bull crossed with a white bull, and they actually somehow produce roan. Well, roan is red and white. So it's actually a bull that has red or reddish brown and white fur together. So anytime we see two traits actually appear together, this is an example of codominance. If you think of cooperating, like doing something together, if you see both traits actually come together where both of them are there, this is an example of codominance. So hopefully this is helpful to get through that take-home quiz.